This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited review for Strixhaven. So far, I've looked at all the non-green monocolored cards in Strixhaven, and today I'm looking at the green ones. As the week goes on, I'll be covering all of the other cards in the set before concluding the set review with an archetype guide. Keep in mind that in this review, I'm only talking about the limited formats. That's draft and sealed. I won't be talking about formats like standard or commander. I conclude my evaluation of each of these cards with a letter grade that sort of sums up my thoughts about the card. If you're new to my set reviews, there's an explanation of what each grade means in the description of this video. Another notable thing about this set is that it has the Mystical Archive cards. These are a special set of reprints, and one from the archive appears in every Strixhaven pack, so I'll also be reviewing all of those cards in the last part of each of these videos. Alright, let's look at our first green card. First up, it's Accomplished Alchemist, which for 3 generic and a green is a 2/5 elf druid at rare. You can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and you can tap it to add X mana of any one color, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. This has nice defensive stats and does a good job of ramping and fixing, and sometimes you'll be able to get even more mana out of it, provided you gain life. This format has a life gain deck, and it also has a couple of mill decks, and I think that puts us in a pretty good place. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Basic Conjuration, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a rare sorcery lesson. It says look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You gain 3 life. So, Lesson is a new spell subtype they introduced in this set, and there are various cards that have a mechanic called Learn in this set that let you get a card that's a lesson out of your sideboard. So that's what's going on with this Lesson card here. This will be a nice thing to grab when you do learn, since it gives you some pretty nice card selection and gains you some life. If you end up with no learn at all, it would be a somewhat passable card in your deck too. It is a bit clunky to be sure, but gaining life off of it helps offset that problem. It's probably a C- in your main deck and a B- in your sideboard. Next up, it's Bayou Groff, which for 1 generic and a green is a 5/4 plant dog at common, and as an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature or pay 3 generic. I like the upside we have here. It is either a 5 mana 5/4, a sort of passable card already, or a 2 mana 5/4 that you sacrifice a creature for. Doing the sacrifice thing can be a bit risky if you're giving up a real card to cast it on turn 2, since if your opponent can remove this dog or otherwise make it hard for it to attack, the cost will definitely not be worth it. But just having the option available to you is great, and sometimes you'll have very expendable creatures, like pest tokens. And double spelling with this on like turn 5 by giving up a pest token seems pretty good. This is a solid common for green. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Big Play, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +2/+2 and gains reach until end of turn. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. 2 mana for +3/+3, and one of those +1/+1 sticks around as a counter is pretty nice. It means you end up getting some permanent value from it beyond the turn you play it, which isn't always the case with tricks. And that's a boost big enough to help your creature win most combat. Aggressive green decks will likely always run the first copy of this, but it is still a trick. It's situational and risky, and you'll cut it a lot. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Bookworm, which for 7 generic and a green is a 7/7 worm at uncommon. It's got trample, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life and draw a card, and you can pay 2 generic and a green to put it from your graveyard into your library, 3rd from the top. This seems like a good finisher for both the ramp decks in this format, blue-green and blue-red. It isn't quite Pelakka Worm, but it does a reasonable impression. Gaining you life and a card means that no matter what, you're getting something for your mana investment, and the fact that you can put them back in your deck to draw in a few turns will feel pretty good, even if your opponent manages to remove it. I think this is a C+. If it's even easier to get the mana for this, and I could kind of see that happening, it may move into first pickable territory, but yeah, for now, I'm going to say C+. Next up, it's Charge Through, which for 1 green mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gains trample until end of turn, draw a card. In your typical format, this would be close to an F. It replaces itself, but the effect it has can be useless, or close to it, a huge chunk of the time. After all, you need blocks to go a certain way, and you need creatures of a certain size for trample to even matter. However, in a format with lots of green spell payoffs, including in green, I think this will be pretty alright. It will trigger those payoffs while replacing itself, so that's not too bad. Still, it's probably a card you cut a lot. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Containment Breach, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery lesson, and it says destroy target artifact or enchantment. If its mana value is 2 or less, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. This is not going to be a great lesson for this limited format. This format is surprisingly low on both enchantments and artifacts. It has 4 enchantments total and 13 artifacts. Of those, there's only 8 of them that you can destroy with this to get back an insect token. The reason there are so few artifacts and enchantments in this set is because this set is super heavy on instants and sorceries, and so those card types got whittled down, and that means this isn't as good as it would be in a normal format. Still, you can probably pick it up pretty easily, so having it as an option when you do run into those isn't too bad. It's probably an F in your main deck and a D+ as a card you get out of your sideboard when you learn. Next up, it's Devouring Tendrils, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. When the permanent you don't control dies this turn, you gain 2 life. This is Rabid Bite with upside, and I'm all for that. Note that this is not a fight card, only the opposing creature gets damaged, so it's much less risky than a fight is. It still has some downsides, of course. Casting this into open mana from your opponent is asking for trouble, since a 2-for-1 is a real risk, but that risk is worth it for the efficiency. The fact you gain life if the creature dies is nice additional upside, especially because black-green likes it when you gain life, but mostly this is just Rabid Bite with some very minor upside, which I think makes it a B-. Next up, it's Dragon Guard Elite, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 human druid at rare. It's got Magecraft, which is a new mechanic in this set where your card does something whenever an instant or sorcery is cast or copied by you. In this case, Dragon Guard Elite gets a +1/+1 counter, and she also has an activated ability for 4 generic and 2 green that doubles the number of counters on her. Obviously, this is really good. A 2-mana 2/2 with prowess is usually pretty nice, and in most ways, this is an upgrade. Getting a permanent boost is big, and then in the late game, it will become too big for most boards, thanks to the ability to double counters. You'll first pick this most of the time, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Ecological Appreciation, which for X, 2 generic and a green is a mythic rare sorcery. It says search your library and graveyard for up to 4 creature cards with different names that each have mana value X or less, and reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 of those cards. Shuffle the chosen cards into your library and put the rest onto the battlefield. Exile Ecological Appreciation. If you have a bunch of mana lying around, this is going to be pretty sweet. Both the blue-red and blue-green decks in this format are interested in ramping, so even though this looks like it might be kind of hard to set up, it's going to be easier in this format than in most. So if you pay about 6 mana total for this, you're likely to get a couple of 3-drops, which is a perfectly decent return to get from this. This does kind of have diminishing returns though, because once you get to a certain point, it's not super likely that your deck will have enough good creatures to search up for your opponent to give you 2 of. Now, I know you can get cards out of your graveyard, so I don't mean that you won't have cards to grab. What I mean is you're only going to have so many like 5 and 6 drops, even in a ramp deck, and you're probably not going to be able to search up like 4 6 drops to make your opponent make the decisions. You're going to end up searching up like 2 6 drops, a 5 drop, and a 4 drop. So what I'm saying is paying 4 for X is probably going to have pretty much the same outcome as paying 5+, but still, you do get a 2-for-1 out of it basically no matter what, and usually you'll get your mana's worth. It's slow for sure and takes some setting up, but I think I like this enough to first pick it in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Emergent Sequence, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery, and it says search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. That land becomes a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature that's still a land. Put a +1/+1 counter on it for each land you had into the battlefield under your control this turn. So this is a cool card. It's a lot like Rampant Growth, which is pretty solid as far as fixing and ramping go. And what's great here is it actually adds to the board in a meaningful way, in addition to ramping and fixing for you, since the land will also be a 1/1 at a minimum, and making it a 2/2 won't be particularly difficult. That basically makes it, in a way, a mana dork that comes into play tapped, and you'd pay 2 mana for that for sure. Now, that does come with some downside, like searching up your 1 land for a splash with this is going to hurt, because now your opponent can kill it with a cheap burn spell. So sometimes you may not want to search up your splash land, because you might not be able to get it back if they kill it, but still, ramping and fetching a land and making it into a creature is pretty good. It means that it doesn't have the downside most ramp spells do, where, most ramp spells just ramp, and if you draw one late in the game, it's like, sweet, I drew my Rampant Growth, I really need a land right now. but you really don't. And with Emergent Sequence, you get to add to the board even in those situations. And I think overall that makes this pretty good. I think I'm willing to take it with the first pick sometimes. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Exponential Growth, which has 2 X's in its mana cost as well as 2 green mana symbols. And it's a rare sorcery, and until end of turn, you double target creature's power X times. Obviously enough, this can make a creature pretty dang huge, but it's also really freaking clunky. You need your creature to already have evasion of some kind for this to even matter most of the time, and your opponent can still easily just take down the thing you target, so you have to be extra cautious about casting it. Now, it is worth noting that at a certain point it can make any creature into a threat more or less, like once you get to 8 mana, but it still has some serious downsides that make me really wary of wanting to value this highly, because that creature still needs to have evasion because it's only an until end of turn effect. I think this is just a C. Next up, it's Field Trip, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it says search your library for a basic forest card, put that card onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle, and it has Learn. So this pretty much just ramps for you. It doesn't provide fixing because you can only get a forest, and that's kind of a bummer. Still, ramping looks like a smarter strategy in this format than it does in most. It also has Learn, which will either let you rummage or get a lesson from your sideboard, and both of those are nice additional effects. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Fortifying Draft, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon instant, and it says you gain 2 life. Target creature gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the amount of life you gain this turn. This seems like a solid trick to me. You'll always get 2 life and at least +2/+2 out of it, and that's something an aggro deck would probably already play a copy of most of the time, but then you factor in the potential for a bigger boost, and you get an even better trick. Making this be better than Giant Growth isn't going to be super hard. Still, it is a trick. They're situational, they're risky, and only aggro decks want them, so it is hard to go higher than a C here. Next up, it's Gnarled Professor, who for 2 generic and 2 green is a 5/4 Treefolk Druid at rare. He's got Trample, and when he enters the battlefield, you can Learn. This is good stats for the cost and will effectively draw you a card when it comes down a good chunk of the time. Sign me up for that 2-for-1. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Honor Troll, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/3 Troll Druid at uncommon. It's got Vigilance, and it says if you would gain life, you gain that much life +1 instead, and it says Honor Troll gets +2/+1 as long as you have 25 or more life. Increasing the amount of life you gain is nice, especially because as we've seen, Black-Green has lots of ways to gain life and ways to pay you off for gaining life. This Troll becoming a 4/4 isn't going to be impossible, but you really shouldn't count on it either. It's mostly going to be a 2/3 with a decent life gain enhancer. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Karok Wrangler, which for 4 generic and a green is a 3/3 Elf Druid at uncommon. It's got Magecraft, and in this case, you get a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This has some mediocre stats, but boy, it has a very, very strong Magecraft trigger. Being able to put a counter anywhere is very strong, and if you have instants, it can be particularly punishing. I do think those starting stats hold it back a little bit, but I'm giving it a B-. You can first pick it pretty often. Next up, it's Leyline Invocation, which for 5 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it creates a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token. You put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the number of lands you control. Blue-green is about ramping and having lots of lands in this set, but even so, this doesn't seem especially good to me. It'll make a big vanilla creature that isn't even that efficient in most cases. You'll play this as your top curve if you're lacking something, but most of the time, you probably hope for something better in that role. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Mage Duel, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery, and it costs 2 less to cast if you've cast another instant or sorcery spell this turn, and target creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn, then it fights target creature you don't control. This is a really nice removal spell for green. Even if it couldn't reduce its cost, I would think this would be about a C+. +1/+2 is a nice boost that enables creatures to effectively fight a lot more things. Once you factor in the fact it will only cost a single green mana sometimes, I think we're really looking at premium removal. It does have the downside all green removal tends to have. You might get 2-for-1 if you're not careful, but it's definitely worth it. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Master Symmetrist, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 Rhino Druid at uncommon. It's got Reach, and it says whenever a creature you control with power equal to its toughness attacks, it gains Trample until end of turn. This is quite good. It is a 4-mana 4/4 with Reach and Trample, effectively, since its ability counts itself. On its own, that would make Master Symmetrist something you consider first picking, but then it also grants Trample to all of your other creatures with symmetrical power and toughness, and that makes it really good. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Overgrown Arch, which for 1 generic and a green is a 0/4 Plant Wall at uncommon. It's got Defender, you can tap it to gain 1 life, and you can pay 2 generic mana and sacrifice it to Learn. We've seen walls that can cash themselves in for cards before, and they're always kind of mediocre. However, this one does add life gain to the mix, which is something that can really add up, especially in black-green, where this might be a card that really enables your life gain payoffs. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Professor of Zoomancy, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 bear druid at common, and when it enters the battlefield, it makes a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. This is an excellent common. You get 5/4 worth of stats for 4 mana across 2 bodies, not to mention the life gain synergy the pest token gives you, and the sacrifice synergy the pest token gives you. This is a first pickable card. I'm giving it a B. It's probably green's best common. Next up, it's Reckless Amplimancer, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 elf druid at common, and you can pay 4 generic and a green to double its power and toughness until end of turn. So this is a bear with some nice late game upside, especially for decks that are either capable of producing a lot of mana or capable of putting +1/+1 counters on stuff, or even better, both. Blue-green is the color pair that will be the rampiest, and I really think it is going to want some late game mana sinks, and this definitely delivers. Now, it isn't especially efficient to pump this thing, but it is something to do with your mana, and obviously +1/+1 counters will make that ability feel even better. This is just going to be a solid 2-drop for pretty much all the green decks. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Scurrid Colony, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 squirrel at common. It's got reach, and it gets +2/+2 as long as you control 8 or more lands. This is an alright 2-drop in the early game, and when the game gets late, it does get bigger. Now, a 4/4 probably isn't going to be a huge game changer by the time you have 8 lands, but it's not going to hurt either. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Spined Karok, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/4 crocodile at common. This has alright defensive stats for the cost. You'll play it sometimes if that's what you need, but mostly you hope you won't need it. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Springmane Servant, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/2 elk at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life. This is a solid creature for green decks. It has alright stats, and the fact it gains life will enable a number of synergies in this format. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Tangle Trap, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant, and it says choose one. Tangle Trap deals 5 damage to target creature with flying, or destroy target artifact. It's kind of funny this isn't a lesson. I almost feel like it could have been. Anyway, we see these modal destroy artifact or flyer type cards a lot, and they're always alright. This one probably isn't one you want to put in your main deck because this format has so few artifacts. However, if you see 5 or so targets against someone, both flyers and artifacts, it can be a nice sideboard card. I'm giving it a D+ as a main deck card and a C+ out of the sideboard. Next up, it's Verdant Mastery, which for 5 generic and a green is a rare sorcery, and it says you may pay 3 generic and a green rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Search your library for up to 4 basic land cards and reveal them. Put one of them onto the battlefield tapped under an opponent's control if the 3 generic and a green cost was paid. Put 2 of them onto the battlefield tapped under your control and the rest into your hand. Then shuffle. While ramping and fixing are nice and limited, most of the time big expensive ramp spells like this aren't so good. You do get 4 lands out of the deal, which is pretty awesome, and 2 of them will even come into play, but you also just spent a ton of mana without an immediate impact on the board of any kind, and the alternate cost here generally won't be worth it, since giving your opponent a land seems pretty painful. You'll definitely run this in some blue-green and even blue-red decks because you're super into mana, but I think it isn't something you want to be first picking. I'm giving it a C+. Alright, Verdant Mastery was our last regular green card in Strixhaven Draft Boosters. Now we're going to move towards the Mystical Archive cards. These are cards from a special set of reprints that are inserted into each Strixhaven pack. There's 1 card from the Mystical Archive in every Strixhaven pack. That means you'll have 24 in every pod, which means you'll see them a significant chunk of the time, but they're not going to be everywhere either. Sort of think of them like rares or mythic rares, and the ones that are rares or mythic rares are even rarer than regular rares or mythic rares. So, alright, let's go ahead and look at our first card, which is Abundant Harvest, which for 1 green mana is a rare sorcery, and it says choose land or non-land. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of the chosen kind. Put that card into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Unlike most of the cards in the archive, this is a new one. I think it seems pretty decent, kind of like a weird adventurous impulse. If you really need to hit a land drop, this will do it for you. And if you really need to stop flooding, well, that'll do that for you too. Like most efficient card selection cards we see, this is probably just as solid playable. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Adventurous Impulse, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon sorcery, and it says look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So, speaking of Adventurous Impulse, it's also here. And it's funny how similar these cards will play in Limited. This is a fine card for green decks, but not much else. It's nice that if you're flooding, it can help you get out of it. Sounds familiar, right? And if you're desperate for mana, it can help you there too. It is also a cheap spell, which is always upside in this set. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Channel, which for 2 green mana is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says until end of turn, anytime you could activate a mana ability, you may pay 1 life. If you do, add colorless mana. This is another one of these mystical archive cards that people will drastically overrate in Limited because they know it's been so powerful in the game's past. And don't get me wrong, being able to make a bunch of mana for only 2 is pretty strong. The problem is you won't have a way to combo off with this basically ever in a Limited deck. And sure, maybe on turn 3 it lets you play your 7-drop, and that's pretty great for sure. But you go down a card and a bunch of life in the process, and if your opponent has removal, they're suddenly outcarding you and you're in a ton of trouble. Then there will be times when Channel is useless or close to it, and that's rough too. Ramp decks are a thing in this format, as I've been saying in this video, and that helps its case some, but in short, it is super inconsistent, kind of like Dark Ritual. It will be a super swingy play that sort of makes or breaks you, and that's the ideal scenario, and it's hard to give something so all over the place anything more than a C+. Next up, it's Cultivate, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put one onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, then shuffle. I always like this card when we see it. It's great fixing, even helping you splash a card with 2 colored mana symbols. It also happens to ramp you, which is great too, especially in this set. I think this is a B-, like it is most of the time when we see it. You can take it pretty early. Next up, it's Harmonize, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare sorcery that says draw 3 cards. This is a bit clunky as a sorcery, but 4 mana to draw 3 cards is a good enough deal that I don't care too much. You do have to find the time to cast it, of course, and sometimes tapping out for this will just be impossible because you need to add to the board. But if you're able to cast this and survive, it will really help you outcard your opponent, which can, of course, get you that win. I think you first pick this sometimes. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Crozen Grip, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare instant with split second, which means it can't be responded to. Nothing else can be added to the stack when you play it until it resolves. And it says destroy target artifact or enchantment. This format has too few enchantments and artifacts for this to be a main deck card. It's a D if you play it there, and a C out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Natural Order, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a green creature. Search your library for a green creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle. So this has an inherently powerful effect that can let you cheap a pretty impressive green creature into play, but there are a couple of things you'll need to have going for it to be worthwhile. First, you need a green creature worth sacrificing. The good news is that pest tokens are green and very expendable, so sacrificing one of those to Natural Order, even just for like a 4 or 5 drop, will feel fine. Sacrificing a real creature to this normally won't be so great as you're 2-for-1ing yourself, so what you search up better be pretty darn impressive. The good news is there are some scary green creatures you can search up, some we've seen in this video, and others we'll see when we get into the multicolor part of the review. Overall, I think this is quite strong, even if it does ask for some significant setup. The fact that there are green creature tokens in this format, which are relatively plentiful, is what really makes it good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Primal Command, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says choose 2. Target player gains 7 life. Put target non-creature permanent on top of its owner's library. Target player shuffles their graveyard into their library, or search your library for a creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So this isn't that impressive in Limited. It's very clunky and mostly doesn't have a way to impact the board directly, and that's a liability. Only one mode can do that, and it can only go after a non-creature permanent. Note, by the way, that that permanent can be a land, so that will matter sometimes if you want to blank an opposing draw. I think one of the better things to do with this in Limited is probably choose the life gain and tutor option. It's still really slow, but by gaining life, you will probably untap and get to play the best creature in your deck on the subsequent turn. I still have a hard time seeing this as anything more than a C, though. Next up, it's Regrowth, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare sorcery, and it says return target card from your graveyard to your hand. This isn't incredible in Limited. 2 mana to return 1 card from your graveyard is just card selection. It does get better if you have bombs and other powerful stuff going on, but mostly it isn't that impressive. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Snakeskin Veil, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon instant, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains hexproof until end of turn. This is an alright combat trick that gives your creature a permanent boost while also being useful against removal. Like all tricks, it's situational, but it does enough that I think it's pretty solid for most green decks, giving it a C. And our last card in the Mystical Archive in this video, and the last card in this video, and the last monocolored card of this set review is Weather the Storm, which for 1 generic and a green is a rare instant, and it says you gain 3 life, Storm. And Storm means whenever you cast it, you copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. So, on its own, Weather the Storm normally probably wouldn't be very good in Limited. However, this set has 2 things, maybe even 3 things going on that make it something worth thinking about at least. First, the black-green deck has lots of life gain payoffs, so any card that gains life will be more worthwhile, and each copy of this will trigger a life gain payoff if it's the kind that says whenever you gain life, and that's a big deal. Second, the Magecraft mechanic triggers for every copy of a spell, so if you can get the Storm going here, you'll be able to trigger Magecraft that many times too. And like Grape Shot, which we saw earlier in the week, this is cheap, and getting a Storm count on it isn't a pipe dream, especially because it's an instant. You can use your opponent's spells to help you trigger this more, and that definitely makes it even more flexible. Now, with all of that out of the way, I still don't think this is a great card in most Limited decks, but in most formats it would be an F, and I think in this one, I would value it as a C. Those are all the green cards that will appear in Draft Boosters in Strixhaven. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing the first of 2 videos covering the multicolored cards in Strixhaven. There's so many this time around that they had to be split into 2 videos. Tomorrow I'll be looking at Quantrix, Witherbloom, and Lorehold. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.